So in this next section, we're going to be applying a number of texture images, as well as using some of Modo's procedurals, gradients, and even some built-in shaders and other things like that. Now, we'll be going from this basic clay model to a fully textured object. We'll also be looking at one of the new materials in Modo called thin film. We also have an interesting technique of applying a bump map and an image map on a transparent surface to make it appear as though there is a sticker applied to the outside of that plastic. We've got a number of things going on here, as well as using bump maps and spec maps. We're using those same images and converting them to grayscale directly in Modo. So that way you don't have to take them to another application. You can do everything right inside of Modo. We also use some of the retopology tools to scatter some cherries throughout the box, which is kind of fun. So let's go ahead and jump in. Now we're going to work on our cellophane material a little bit. But one thing I want to mention is that you can resize your render preview here just by dragging the bar as soon as you get the double-ended arrow. And the reason I did this is to make it smaller, so that way preview renders a little bit quicker. We can click on the material in the actual render preview, and that will pull up the material we want to edit. So for example, I clicked on the cellophane, and it pulled up my cellophane material. Of course, if you don't have any material assignments, it'll probably just pull up the base material if you have one. So for the cellophane, I know that I want it to be a darkish yellow color that is semi-transparent with a nice reflective surface. And we're going to be using something new in Ada 1 called thin film. But before we apply that, let's set up our material to prepare for that thin film. So the diffuse amount, the diffuse color, specular reflection, and transparency amount are going to be the settings we tweak here. In the prior video, I set up the transparent amount to be about 75%. And I know that's going to be somewhat close to what I want. But we really need to tune in our color. So let's just bring it up to a yellow color. Obviously, that's a little bit much, but we're just going to crank it up a little and let preview do its thing. Not quite what I want. So what we can do is we can just tweak the saturation down and a little bit more. I want it to be right about there. We'll just key in a value of 70 saturation. So I want it to be yellow hued, but not too terribly much. Okay, and now what we can do is lighten or darken this with the diffuse amount. So I know that the diffuse amount of 80 is too much, but just to show you what happens when we turn up to 100, is it brightens it all the way up to that color that we just specified. Now I don't want that. I want it to be somewhere around 35 to 50%. And let's just try 50% first. That's very close to the look I want. We might fine tune that a little bit, but let's go ahead and keep the 50% diffuse amount. And with the transparent amount, if we put that back up at 100, if you put it at 100, obviously it's going to be too transparent. And at 0, it's not transparent at all. And what I want is something that's semi-transparent, not completely transparent, so you can still see it. And with this color that I have, with this diffuse amount, I found that between 65 and 75% transparency is very close to what I want, but 70 still seems a little too low. So let's set this to 75. Yes, that looks very good. Let's use this. Okay, so now we can work with the thin film. We could just work with the refractive index here and set up some dispersion and absorption. But as I previously mentioned, in 801, there's a new material that does all of this for you automatically. It's very nice. And it's called thin film. So under add layer in the shader tree, let's go to custom materials and apply the thin film. If it's not automatically created inside of your cellophane group, make sure that you drag and drop it here. And make sure that it also goes above the material for that group. So inside the thin film material properties, what we want to do now is set a refractive index for cellophane. Quick internet search turns up that's approximately 1.4721. So let's go ahead and key that in. All right, so we're getting there. Not too shabby so far. The other thing that we could do is set the thickness, and this is in nanometers. And we'll actually keep this exactly where it's at for now. So the default for that's going to be just fine. It doesn't quite look like cellophane just yet. So the one last aspect we need is the reflection of the surface. And being that we just set up that thin film, it's going to create a rainbow or a colored gradient across this, as you would expect on cellophane or soap bubbles. Let's turn off the thin material just for effect here. And we're going to set the reflection amount to match specular. And the specular amount's at 20%, which is awfully high for reflectivity. And you can see that we're getting our environment and our light box reflecting on this surface. It might take a little bit to render because reflection is pretty hard on rendering. All right, so you can see there. We also have a little bit of stuff that we don't want showing up in the reflectivity, which is fine. We can deal with that in a little bit. So now let's turn on the thin film. And you can see it's giving us that nice colored gradient we want. It's a little harsh. And what we need to do is turn that down a little. And the way we can deal with this is to turn down the reflectivity. So we do still want some specularity. So if we turn the spec down to about 10%, you can see that that tunes it in a little bit. But it's still a little too harsh for my taste. So let's turn off match specularity. And let's just key in a value for reflection ourselves. We'll go 2%. That seems a little more realistic for something like this. And we'll let preview do its thing. Let's ramp it up. We'll go 5%. And that's about where I want. It's not as harsh as it was, but it looks much better than it did. Then we also had the reflections showing up that we didn't want. And you can see it right here on the top. That curved shape with this little black box. And the way we can do that is by turning on blurry reflections. And that'll blur it right out. We also want to turn up the reflection rays just to enhance the quality of the reflection a little bit. And I'm going to turn this up to about 512. No, I'm no render master, but I do know that turning up the rays on something can be incredibly dangerous for your render time. So be careful with the amount you turn that up to. I would say safely somewhere between 256, 512. You can even go up to 1024, but that's starting to really push it, I think, for certain things. And of course, we only have this one item in the scene. And you can see how long it's taking for preview to calculate just the surface. So I wouldn't go too terribly high. And also, while we're working on other parts of this box, we're going to be turning off that material and probably hiding the cellophane item itself altogether. So that way, when we're looking at preview for other things, it doesn't slow our render preview down. One last setting I want to set is the specular roughness, which is at the default of 40%. And specular roughness is basically like glossiness. The lower the value, the tighter the specular hit will be. The higher the value, the greater or wider the specular hit will be. And being that this is a pretty reflective surface, I want to set this a little bit lower than the default. Let's go with about 20%. So the specular hit would show up a little bit tighter now with the roughness at 20% than it would at 40. What we're going to be doing in this video is tidying up our shader tree a little bit and getting rid of a number of excess materials that we have. Not material groups, but actual materials. But before we start any work on that, we should probably turn off the cellophane material and the render boolean because it's causing us to have a bit of a harsh render time here. Let's go to our box material and then turn off the visibility for the cellophane material. You can see that renders much more quickly. But we still want to turn off the render boolean and the window boolean object that we have. That's being used by the render boolean. So now you can see the render times are much better, and we can proceed with our shader tree cleanup. So under filter, let's go ahead and set this to material. And what this allows us to do is to filter out just the materials we have in our shader tree. So obviously we want to keep the light box material, We also want to keep the cellophane material. What we want to do is get rid of everything but those two and one other. And the reason is because we don't need these at all right now. And when we do need an extra material, we'll add that as we need it. Instead of having to troubleshoot all these extra materials, we'll just build from the ground up. Now let's turn that filter off. And we need to pull this material out of this top mat group. So we'll pull this out and put it on the very bottom of the box material group that we have here. What this lets us do is use this material as the master material for the entire object. So if we set this to a garish color like red or green or what have you, you can see that the entire object's color has changed. So we'll just go back to white for that real quick. And we'll just set this as 255, 255, 255. Okay. And now we can control the specular reflection and all sorts of other settings for the entire box. And before we do anything else, let's go ahead and set the spec amount down to 0. While it's a cardboard box, it's going to have some appliques and paint and plastic bits on it. And it'll be nice to start with a fresh, clear specular amount in the beginning. So that way we don't have to troubleshoot, again, any kind of weird issues with specularity. And now we can proceed with importing and applying our texture maps. Now it's time to import our first image map, and we're going to be importing the Modo's logo. But before we do that, I want to talk about how we can import images. There are all sorts of ways in Modo to do this. You can drag and drop it on a Modo in a number of panels, including the images, the shader tree, the OpenGL viewport, and also in preview render. The easiest way, though, in my opinion, is to either use the images tab, add clip, and then load it that way, or from the shader tree. And in fact, if you do it from the shader tree, we can place it exactly where we want it to start with. So we know we're going to be placing this on the front and on this top part here. We know that's the top mat, and if we select it, click on add layer, go to image map, and we'll go load image. And now we will navigate to our image map. And I'm going to use the Modo's logo red. Okay, so you can see it's automatically applied in the shader tree there. Let's go check the texture locator and make sure that it's not set to UV map. You want to do a planar projection. That would be along the Z. Oh, and hey, look. Oops, we applied it to the wrong material. But that's an easy fix. All you gotta do is drag and drop that to the one we want. And I know that's actually the back material. And you can see that's applied right here. It's obviously a bit large. Let's scale this down to fit. We'll try a 1 millimeter. And that's obviously too small. Let's go 10 centimeters. Oops. Make sure that's on all axes. Okay, so that's almost there. And now what we can do is go into our 3D viewport. Let's select in item mode the box and then deselect it. And the reason we select and then deselect the mesh is so that we have it visible in a shaded view and not just wireframe. And you can see the image map is previewed there. And what we want to do now is actually grab the texture locator. So if we go to the back material, select the image, hit the W key for move, we can see the texture locator there. And what we want to do is bring this on up to the top right hand panel here. Okay, so it's still a little large. And we can either scale this using the scale tool, or you can go into the texture locator properties tab and manually key in values like we just did. But I think what we'll do is we'll just scale this directly in the viewport. It's a little more intuitive. And I think we'll probably rotate this as well to match the curvature of the box. And maybe scoot that down a little. Okay, and now we'll scale it just so we can get a little bit more of that S there. And right about there is getting close to where I want it. Scale it down a little more and then move it into place. I want to rotate it a little bit more like so. I like that. We also don't want this repeating pattern. Let's turn off the horizontal and vertical repeat under the Properties tab. We'll just do Reset. What this does is it resets along the edge of the image. A little more information about the horizontal and vertical repeat. Reset will reset the pixels outside of the image, as we've done here. Now, let's say you wanted to repeat the pixels on the border of the image. Now, what you want to do in this case is set it to edge, and it will do just that. Now, another example, which we're actually going to be doing a little bit later in the video, is to make an image a layer mask, and we'll actually be using the alpha channel only for that, so we can kind of stamp it out. And the way you have to do that is to use edge mode to repeat the alpha transparent pixels on the border of the image, and then also set the alpha channel to use the alpha only. Like I said, we'll discuss this in much greater detail and actually go through the process of doing this a little bit later. If we rotate around to the back, you can see it's projected all the way through. We're going to create a selection set for this. So if we go back into polygon mode by holding the shift key and then pressing the space bar, or just by clicking this icon right here with the polygon, we can go in and select polygons that we want to create the selection set from. And I know I just want these front polygons here. So we'll select all of these. And for future use, we can select all the way to the other side, not just the area that we currently want, because we know we're going to be applying another image on this left side of the box here. We'll deselect those. Okay. And grab this edge here. Right. We don't want those on the top there. That's the top of the box where the cardboard is. Now that we have our polygon selected, we can go to Select, Assign Selection Set. We'll create a new one. We'll just call this Top Front Logos. Okay, so now that we have that selection set created, how do we stop that image from being projected all the way through? It's actually quite simple. What we need to do is go to one of our materials, particularly this one called Back Matte, which is where we currently have that applied to. We'll add a new layer, and we'll just make a group. Now, this can be in the Back Matte group, or it can be outside. And for the meantime, we're going to keep this inside of the Back Matte. And what we want to do is drag and drop this image into that group. Okay, so now it's inside of it, and it should still project all the way through. And the reason is because we haven't assigned that group to be the selection set yet. Highlight that group, go to Polygon Tag Type, set it to Selection Set, and then Polygon Tag to be the Top Front Logos. So now you can see that it's not projected all the way through to the backside. In fact, you can see a nice cutoff as you would expect on an actual box. One thing we're going to do for all of these images that we import is to make sure that Modo is not automatically adjusting the color space. The reason is because we generally want to control how our images are displayed ourselves. Now, if your images are not already color corrected or in the color space that you want them, you could probably use this feature, but I've already got my images to the color space that I want. So select the image node in the shader tree, and then go to the Image Still tab, and then right here, Color Space is default, we'll set this to none. We'll be doing this for pretty much every image we import. And now that we've done that, we can create a specular layer for this image. And the way we're going to do that is by simply right-clicking on the Modo Logos Red 002 inside the shader tree, and then click Instance. And what this is going to allow us to do is control with a referenced layer the settings of the instance. And the reason that's useful is, especially when we are trying to do quick iterations or we have to do lots of changes, it's much easier to just modify one instead of going in and modifying every single individual layer or node. So for this layer, the instance here, we're going to right click on the effect, and we'll set this to specular amount. That's under basic, specular amount. Now, right off, you're going to notice that there's a box around my type, and that's obviously not desired. So let's explain what's happening first here. is that Modo is internally converting the image to a grayscale. And in Modo, if an image has alpha transparency, it's automatically converted to white. Now, we don't want that at all. The way that we can fix this is to go over here and set the layer to be inverted. And now you can see we're only getting specular where there is an image. Okay, and we can control that with the opacity and also the high and low values. I highly recommend using the opacity to control the overall strength of the opacity of your specularity, and then to use the high and low values to narrow the width of the specularity. So, for example, the lower values can be bumped up from a black to a gray, and you can see it becomes less pronounced. So we'll set that back to 0 for now. We're going to leave this to be rather strong at the moment. Now we're going to be using a combination of spec and reflectance. So one of the easy ways we can do this is by duplicating this instance and setting it to reflection. Or we can create a material inside of this group and then set the reflectance to match spec. And that's what we'll do. We'll select the top front logos layer, add a layer, and we're going to go to material. Make sure that's at the bottom here of this group, otherwise it will override any settings there. And you'll notice that we had two different specular values in this area, and we have two different colors, which is definitely not wanted. And the reason is because we have these two different layers on top of each other. And so this one has some different settings from this one. And what we can do is copy these settings here. Go down to copy. Select the material we just created. Right click and paste. And so now they match exactly. Now to control the reflectance value, we'll just go and hit match specular. And you can see it is blown way out. Not what we want. And so now what we can do is go in and use the opacity to control this. We'll set this just to demonstrate the value of 50%. It's down a little lower, but it's still very reflective. So if we go even a little bit further, say 25%, you can see it's becoming more visible and less reflective. Now, most surfaces, even at 1 or 2%, are highly reflective. And since this is supposed to resemble a type of laminated piece of cardboard, that's what we're going to match. And right around 1 or 2% is going to get us what we want. And we'll go with 2% for now. And we have one more layer to create, and that's a bump layer. And we're going to do the same thing as we did for the specular layer. However, we're going to duplicate this specular layer as it's already an instance of the diffuse color layer. And it also has most of the same basic settings that we want for the bump layer. And that is, it's inverted, it's already being converted to grayscale. It has all the basic same settings that we want. So let's right click, duplicate, and then right click on the effect, and we'll set this to, it's under surface shading, to bump. Now the opacity, on the other hand, is much too low for the bump. We'll set that back up to 100%. You can see it kind of pops out a little bit. Now, the other reason that I created this material is so that we could individually control the bump of anything within this group. For example, this Modo's logo. Otherwise, had we used the base material, we would be controlling the bump of everything. So let's change that to, we'll say 1 centimeter just to see what it looks like. And now it really pops out, which is probably a little too much. We'll set this to 0.5 centimeters, which is 5 millimeters. And that's a little large for our needs. However, once we start adding other things underneath this, it might not stand out as much. So we'll stick with that for now. And if we need to, pretty much just like anything when you are creating, we'll go ahead and tweak it to our liking or as needed. And the last thing we want to do is remove any kind of redundancy we have in the shader tree here. So we have this top front logos material group, and it's parented to the back mat. It doesn't really need to be in this material anymore. So what we can do is make it a child of the main box group. Let's go ahead and minimize it and then grab the group and place it underneath the cellophane material group. As we work on the shader tree, we'll move any of the edited groups to the top, and anything that isn't being worked on currently is going to be toward the bottom. Of course, they'll all reside above our base material for the box.